to the spring lecture series sponsored by the Faculty Student Association here at Buffalo State College. I put emphasis on spring. Welcome to spring. We're delighted to have you here this evening. I'd like to express appreciation to the History Club, to the Faculty Student Association, to USG, to our Public Relations Office for the support that they have provided in making this series possible. I'd also like to thank the faculty committee, Professor E.O. Smith, Professor David Lampe, Professor Monroe Fordham, and Professor Anthony Neal and their colleagues for putting this series together for you. We're delighted to have Professor Chomsky here with us this evening and welcome him to Buffalo and Buffalo State College. We hope you enjoy the evening. We believe that you will enjoy it. Thank you very much, and I'd like to now introduce Professor Ken Mernitz from the History Department, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Good evening. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky, recognized worldwide as one of the pioneering contributors and foremost authorities on linguistics. Noam Chomsky has also, in his spare time, exercised his skills of critical analysis concerning the affairs of the world. Whether he's focused on the former Soviet Union, mainland China, United States, Israel, Iraq, or other states, he has consistently supported freedom of the individual, dignity, and also creativity. Engaging in that creativity, he has himself achieved much in the last 4 decades, over a score of books, widely acclaimed, member of numerous prestigious societies, and also a very outstanding speaker on the world stage. Whether agreeing with his analysis or not, one must surely treasure his ability to bridge his theoretical expertise with his strong sense of civic responsibility in a public forum. And now please welcome Professor Noam Chomsky.
One of those talks where you can't see the audience because of the lights, so I'll assume you're out there. I want to say some things about the world order that's coming into view, what's called the New World Order, and specifically talk about the case of the Middle East as a kind of case study. It's a natural one. The Middle East is important in itself and what's happening there. Also, it's an obvious choice for understanding of the New World Order, and that for a number of reasons. First, the New World Order, or at least the U.S. version of it, was proclaimed by George Bush with reference to the Middle East. That was in January 1991, and what was happening late January 1991, what was happening there, he said, was to teach the essential lessons of the New World Order. And I think there's much truth to that. At the time, bombs and missiles were raining on Baghdad, Basra, peasant conscripts, mostly Kurds and Shiites, trying to hide in the sands. Later, George Bush and the United States stood by while Saddam Hussein carried out murderous atrocities, destroying the Shiite uprising in the south and then the Kurds in the north. The reason for the U.S. passivity in the face of these atrocities was explained by the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, and others. Friedman explained that, well, of course, our delicate sensibilities were distressed by all of these atrocities carried out by Saddam Hussein under the eyes of George Bush and Norman Schwarzkopf, there were more important issues, stability, and stability required that Iraqi power under Saddam Hussein remain. He said the best of all worlds, from the point of view of Washington, would be if some military junta would take power and wield the iron fist in Iraq, exactly the way Saddam Hussein had done before, much to the appreciation of the U.S. allies, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and of course the boss in Washington. But if we couldn't get the best of all worlds, namely a clone of Saddam Hussein, since his being there was kind of embarrassing, then we'd have to settle for second best, namely Saddam Hussein himself. So that was the first lesson of the New World Order, and I think it's a realistic one. I mentioned the U.S. version of the New World Order. There actually was an earlier version. It was produced about a year earlier by the South Commission, representing the vast majority of the human race. The South Commission is a collection of economic planners, government officials, religious leaders, and so on from the countries of the South. That means essentially the former colonial domains, almost the entire world. They published a quite interesting and important report in 1990 called Challenge to the South. In it they reviewed the miserable state of the traditional Western domains, which had been devastated once again in the 1980s by the catastrophe of capitalism that swept large parts of the world and were, of course, particularly destructive in the South. And they described what they called a kind of a new colonialism that's being established by the wealthy and the powerful, with the South being driven even back even more than before into a kind of service role. And they called for a new world order, was their phrase, that will respond to the South's plea for justice, equity, and democracy in the global society. Well, that was published by Oxford University Press, and it sank like a ton of lead. It was never reported. I never could see any comment on it, apart from some comments of my own. It just was the wrong story and the wrong version of the New World Order. Well, the relation between these two calls and the reception given to them, that also tells us something about the New World Order, something obvious. A second reason why the Middle East is of significance in looking at the New World Order, into which we are entering, is that the region has extraordinary importance and has for a long time, ever since oil was discovered there. It was certainly recognized by the Second World War, if not before, that this was the major source of cheap and abundant energy in the world and would remain so for several generations to come. In the 1940s, the New World Order of that day was being designed by the United States, which was in a position of unprecedented global power, and enough power so that it was realistic to plan the organization of the world, and every region was assigned its role. The Middle East was assigned its role, and its role was to provide energy resources to the West, meaning primarily the United States and its British client and others who went along. Not just the oil, but crucially the profits from the oil. The United States itself didn't need the oil at the time, but it very much wanted to have the profits and the control over this strategic resource as a way of dominating global society. It was taken very seriously. The State Department described Saudi Arabia as a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in world history, probably the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment. President Eisenhower described it as strategically the most important area in the world. The United States intended at the time, in effect, to extend the Monroe Doctrine over that region. The French were expelled, the British were allowed in, but as a client. They were to be a lieutenant, as American diplomats put it in secret, our lieutenant in the region. That was do some of the dirty work for us, but basically we'd run it. So that's extending the Monroe Doctrine beyond the Western Hemisphere to include the Middle East as well. Since then, it's been the main target for U.S. military forces. Intervention forces, which are the core of the military system, have been directed primarily at the Middle East. There's a ring of bases surrounding the region, global, in fact. It goes all the way from Guam and the Philippines to the Azores, and a ring of naval bases as well. The pretext throughout the Cold War, the pretext was that we had to defend the region from the Russians. That's a reflex. Every action taken in international affairs was given that explanation. It was obvious always that that was not the real reason, in fact was rather fraudulent. And we don't have to argue about it anymore because now the point is publicly conceded. After the Russians fell, the Russians collapsed, March 1989, November 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, it was conceded openly that it wasn't the Russians we were worried about. The first place it was conceded was every year, every spring, the White House presents Congress with a kind of a glossy booklet explaining the new Pentagon budget, and it's always more or less the same. It describes the awesome threats we face and how we need all of these huge new weapon systems and so on in order to face them, to deal with them. And meanwhile, we have to keep the defense industrial system, which means most of high technology, functioning, which means the taxpayer has to pay for it, and therefore we're going to have this huge Pentagon budget. That comes year after year, the reason always being that the Russians are coming. Well, it was kind of interesting to see what would happen in the next one, spring 1990, when the Russians obviously weren't coming. Nobody could claim anymore that there were any Russians around. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was gone, and there was the document came out. It was about the same as every year. New military technology and big expenditures and new weapons and so on and so forth, grave threats. But when it turned to the reasons, that had changed. So the bottom line was the same, but the explanation had changed. And it said that our intervention forces have to be built up and aimed primarily at the Middle East, where, it said, the threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. Oh, that's nice. After a generation of total fraud, we now concede that the threats to our interests didn't have anything to do with the Kremlin, which was always true. That was just the excuse for doing it. The Kremlin's gone, so now the threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin door, but we need the intervention forces anyway. And the reason is that we do still face an enormous threat, namely the threat of indigenous nationalism, what's called radical nationalism, meaning indigenous forces that might try to pursue some independent role and take control of the energy resources for themselves, and not understanding that the resources of that region and the wealth that they generate are to flow to the rich men in the West, not to the people of the region. Sort of backward peoples over there, and a lot of them don't understand that simple truth. So we therefore have to make sure that we are ready to beat it into their heads in case they have any funny ideas. The Russians were just a pretext, as they always were. One of the nice things about the end of the Cold War is that we no longer really have to argue simple points. I mean, when I used to give talks about this in the past, I had to give a big story about it. But now it's not necessary to review the facts which show it because it's conceded. Since the Russians aren't there and the pretext is useless, we now tell the truth. And in fact, a lot of for those of you who look at the international affairs literature, you'll have noticed that a lot of the air has cleared. A lot of the deceit is gone. By now, there's much more open expression of straight imperial interests, the need for world domination and so on and so forth, because the pretexts are finished, and it's hard to make up new ones. You try, but there's nothing that's going to quite fill the bill. As a result, there's a lot more simple truths that are being told, and this is one case. As I mentioned, And that, in fact, is true. There has always been considerable concern. There's always concern over indigenous nationalism, which might interfere with the service role of the South. But in the Middle East, given its extraordinary importance, this greatest material prize in world history and so on, it was extraordinarily important to make sure that the enormous profits from oil continue to flow back to the United States and Britain and prop up their economies, and meanwhile leave that lever of control of world affairs in U.S. hands. If you look at U.S. aid, that was intervention forces. If you look at what's called aid, it's primarily directed to that region. There's, first of all, Israel, but that's off the chart. I mean, the amount of aid Israel gets is completely unrelated to anything in world affairs or world history, so we'll put that one aside. But of the other countries, the main aid recipients over the years have been Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan, most of the time. That is, the countries that are intended, that are designed, designated to play the role of sort of local U.S. gendarmes, I mean, keeping order in the region. The aid, of course, has very little to do with need, as these examples show, but has quite a lot to do with profit and power, and the distribution of so-called aid overwhelmingly to that region, and in fact to the gendarmes in that region, again reflects the enormous significance of it. Well, that's two good reasons for looking at the Middle East, and there's a third one, and that's the one I want to concentrate on. Namely, there's recently been a major event, the Oslo Agreements, the Arab-Israeli Accords between Israel and the PLO, agreed upon at the end of August, and finally signed in Washington in mid-September. Now, the Arab-Israeli conflict has certainly not been the only source of turmoil in the region, but it has been a major one, in fact, a very significant one. This event, this important event, it is now claimed, maybe correctly, will resolve that conflict and therefore is quite significant, and tells us, again, by looking at the Oslo Agreement, what was decided upon, what's coming out of it, and by asking why it was reached now and not, say, 5 years ago, we can learn quite a lot about not only the Middle East, but about the New World Order. And in fact, so it is a good case study, and that's what I want to talk about. And in fact, I'll focus attention on the Oslo Agreement. It's very informative, what it means about the United States, about the cultural system in which we live, about the geopolitics of the region, and so on and so forth, and the New World Order. Well, a few comments on the background and what happened with the Oslo Agreement, and then if there's some time, I'll end up with some more remarks on the world order, old and new. Remember the basic facts. I'm sure you're familiar with them. At the end of August, there was an agreement reached in Oslo between Shimon Peres, and Foreign Minister of Israel, and representatives of Yasser Arafat of the PLO. There was a declaration of principles agreed upon. There was a signing in Washington on September 13th. There was an exchange of notes in Washington. Meanwhile, there were background meetings that had been going on for some months secretly on security. They were unknown before, but they were reported in some detail, mainly in the Israeli press, right afterwards. And that collection of agreements, the Oslo Accords themselves, the framework of principles, declaration of principles, the exchange of notes, and the security background discussions, that's basically the set of decisions which were reached. That's what I'll call loosely the Oslo Agreement. The reaction in the United States was interesting. The reaction in the United States was actually complete euphoria. This was considered a major achievement of U.S. foreign policy. Again, Thomas Friedman, the chief diplomatic correspondent of the Times, was the most important commentator, pointed out that he remarked that Arafat had surrendered. He had run off the white flag, receiving nothing in return. So it was a great victory. Friedman's enthusiasm about what had happened is perhaps explained by remarks that he's made elsewhere, where he has said that he has a love affair with Israel, which is really an old flame. And that tells us something, too. You might imagine the reaction in the United States if the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times or any other major journalist had said that he has a love affair with the PLO, which is really an old flame, or in fact any other state, that would have been the end of his career, and there would have been horror. But in this case, it's considered perfectly normal, which tells you something right away, not only about the New World Order, but about American culture. I'll give you some other examples. Well, that was maybe an extreme example of the U.S. euphoria, but if you followed the press or looked at television at the time, you'll notice that there was great excitement about this victory. Abroad, the reaction was somewhat more nuanced. So, for example, the world's leading business newspaper, the Financial Times of London, which is an important paper, essentially speaking for the international business community, it's a daily, they said that their very good correspondents in the Middle East said that for Israel, the settlement was a dream, everything it had ever demanded. For the Palestinians, on the other hand, the fruits are more bittersweet. For Arafat, it was a desperate last throw by a weakened leader. For the Palestinians, the danger was that, like Bosnia's Muslims, they would get nothing if they insisted on what were good arguments for holding out for more, so therefore you get the desperate throw. In Israel itself, again, reactions were kind of more nuanced. Perhaps the most important Israeli journalist, an excellent journalist who's reported on the occupied territories for many years, Danny Rubenstein, now writing for Haaretz, which is sort of like New York Times, the leading paper. He's no particular dove, incidentally, he's extremely good and honest reporter. He's pointed out that there isn't a hint of a solution to the basic problems of the Palestinians in this agreement. Those reactions, I think, are rather accurate. The reference to Bosnia is also kind of appropriate. Sooner or later, I presume, the Muslims and the Bosnians will capitulate to superior force, and the Belgrade press the next day will probably read very much like the American media today, and for similar reasons. In the New World Order, as in the Old World Order, the guys with the guns tend to win and to exult about their victories and to praise themselves for their integrity and their honor and their virtue rewarded. Those are features of the New World Order that persist. Well, to understand the reactions of people like, say, Thomas Friedman and the Financial Times and Danny Rubenstein and other serious commentators, it's necessary to look at the background and see exactly why it should be looked at that way. Here we have to ask what's in fact been at issue all these years. What's held up a settlement? You could go way back, but time being brief, I'll keep to the period since 1967, the period since the 67 war and Israel's taking of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Actually, if we went back further, nothing much would change, but that's the natural period to discuss. Before going into it, there is perhaps a terminological clarification that might be useful to make. There's some obvious facts about what's going on there. One obvious fact is that there are two national groups which claim national rights in the former Palestine. There is, first of all, the indigenous population, and secondly, the settlers who have largely displaced them. So the Palestinians and the Israelis, Israeli Jews, both claim the right of national self-determination there. I'm not going to discuss at all the question of rights, but there is, one can believe what they like about it, but take whatever belief you have. The fact of the matter is that there are two claimants. Now, there are those who reject the claims of one or the other group. So there are some who reject the right of Israelis to national rights in the region. There are some who reject the rights of Palestinians, the indigenous population. And the term that we ought to use for people who reject the rights of one or another group is rejectionists. Namely, they reject the right of one of the two claimants. To use the term rejectionist in that way is completely neutral, doesn't take any stand on whose rights are better or whether there's equal or whatever. It just says, well, rejectionists reject the claim to national self-determination or of one or another group. And I'm going to use the term rejectionist in that way. The reason I make the point is because in doing so, I'm departing from the convention. The convention in the United States is to use the term rejectionist only for those who reject the claim of Israelis to national rights. No one except me, uses the term rejectionist, and a few other people, who uses the term rejectionist in a neutral fashion to refer to those who reject either the national rights of either group. Now, the usage I'm going to keep to, I'll stress again, is neutral. The usage that's conventional is strictly racist. Notice the issue here is not which form of rejectionism is correct. The issue is whether we even refer to rejection of Palestinian rights as rejectionist. If we don't do that, we're just being pure racists. In fact, to see how racist it is, you could imagine what would happen if somebody somewhere were to use the term rejectionist only for those who reject the rights of Palestinians and not to use it for those who reject the rights of Jews. Well, that would be considered a reversion to Nazism or something like that, and that would be quite accurate. You know, it's a really racist usage. In other words, to say that their claim to national rights doesn't even deserve to be discussed, so you're not a rejectionist if you reject it. And that's exactly the usage we follow, except inverted. In this case, it's called honorable or righteous and so on, which illustrates once again the fact that the attitudes, the cultural and intellectual attitudes here towards Arabs and Palestinians in particular, is not only racist, but it's really deeply racist. I mean, so racist that nobody sees anything odd about using the term rejectionist in what is obviously a racist sense. Anyway, I'm not going to be using it that way. I'll be using it in a neutral sense for those who reject the rights of one or the other of the national groups, leaving open the question, separate question as to whose rights prevail, or are they both valid, or whatever. Okay, that's terminology. Coming to facts, in 1967 there was a major war. In that war, Israel ended up occupying the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Syrian Golan Heights. The war itself was extremely dangerous for the world. In fact, the United States and Russia came pretty close, perilously close to nuclear confrontation. Defense Secretary McNamara, then U.S. Secretary of Defense, later gave some information about this and stated that, in his words, we damn near had war. That was at a moment when there was a confrontation between the Russian and the American fleets in the eastern Mediterranean. There were very threatening hotline communications and so on. In any event, the issue was so dangerous that nobody wanted it to go on. Everybody wanted some kind of a settlement. It was just too dangerous to allow that conflict to continue. The next round would obviously be even more dangerous. That was the onset of serious diplomatic efforts. It's really the beginning of serious major diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. And those efforts came to fruition, first step at least, in November 1967, with the passage by the Security Council of the United Nations of Resolution 242, UN 242. Without going into the details, what it basically called for was an exchange, full peace for a full withdrawal. Israel would withdraw from the occupied territories, full withdrawal. In return, there would be full peace. Well, that was overwhelmingly accepted, but not by everybody. In fact, not by the two major groups in conflict. The Arabs rejected the call for full peace, and Israel rejected the call for full withdrawal. The Israeli counterproposal took shape about a year later. It was called then the Alon Plan, and there's various versions of it over the years. All of them more or less alike. Similar proposals have been made recently by Ariel Sharon. Its basic logic has remained the same over the years. Its details have shifted as contingencies have changed. The basic logic is of the Alon Plan. This is the Labor Party. Alon was a dove, so the Labor dove. But there's not much difference in the Israeli spectrum over this. The Alon Plan, the idea is that Israel will keep whatever parts of the territories it wants, but it will abandon administrative responsibility for the areas of heavy Palestinian concentration, population concentration. So Israel won't patrol the streets of Gaza or Nablus. They don't have to have responsibility for the Arab population, but they will take what they want. At that time, what they wanted was the Gaza Strip and approximately a third of the West Bank and the Golan Heights, and at that time, Eastern Sinai. So that's the Alon plan. The basic framework remains with just some modifications in where you draw the borders. Israel's plan at that time was, that was Israel's position. The Arab states were opposing full peace. The rest of the world, including the United States, was calling for full withdrawal and full peace. Now, it's important to stress the full withdrawal part. The U.S. position at that time and the way in which they got the Arab states, everybody formally agreed to UN 247. They just gave different interpretations to it. Okay, so that's the different interpretations are the ones I described. The way in which the Arab states agreed, 242, sorry, was by a direct, the United States explicitly and directly took the position that it was interpreting UN 242 as meaning withdrawal to the pre-June 67 borders with perhaps minor territorial border adjustments, which would furthermore be mutual. So if there was an adjustment that gave Israel a little more here, there would be one that gave, say, Jordan another little more there. That was the official U.S. position. It's worth stressing that because there's been a lot of deceit about the matter since, but it's very clear in the documentary record and not controversial. Well, that was the first diplomatic move, and it ran into that impasse. The question of full peace versus full withdrawal was in abeyance, but it came to a head pretty quickly. It came to a head in February 1971 when the president of Egypt, President Sadat, accepted the American position completely. He agreed to full peace in return for full withdrawal from Egyptian territory, Gaza Strip and the Sinai. The context was a mediation organized by the United Nations, but the position that Sadat took was virtually identical, in fact, actually identical with the U.S. official position. Israel recognized Sadat's proposal as a genuine peace offer, as they put it, but said that they would reject it because they would not withdraw to the 67 borders. There would be no full withdrawal, so they maintained that position. By that point, Egypt had accepted full peace in return for full withdrawal, hence joining the international consensus. Israel refused. At that point, the United States had to make a decision. Was it going to continue with its old policy, therefore supporting Egypt against Israel, or was it going to shift its policy? And that was a debate inside the U.S. government. The State Department, headed by William Rogers, wanted to keep to, and many other elements, wanted to keep to the U.S. position as it had been, which would mean to accept Sadat's proposal, in fact, Sadat accepted the U.S. proposal. Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor, was opposed to that. He said that the United States should not agree to any form of negotiation. It should insist on what he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations. Israel has the guns, and they should maintain control. There was an internal struggle about that in the U.S. government. Kissinger won out, took responsibility for U.S. diplomacy from then on, and that changed U.S. policy. At that point, the U.S., like Israel, became opposed to full withdrawal. So we now had a new lineup. On the one hand, there was, on UN 242 and what it meant, there was now agreement, including the United States, Israel, and Egypt, that it meant full peace, but there was, on the question of full withdrawal, it was now the world on one side and the United States and Israel on the other side. So at that point, the United States essentially was off the world spectrum with regard to Middle East diplomacy. That's issue number one. There was a second question, and that had to do with the matter of rejectionism. UN 242 was flatly rejectionist. It said nothing about the Palestinians. It was only about an agreement among states. It said there must be full peace among the states of the region in return to full Israeli withdrawal. Then the U.S. modified that to mean partial withdrawal. It said nothing about the Palestinians except for a reference to refugees. Said rights of refugees have to be taken care of, but no national rights of Palestinians were recognized, so they were out of it. And in fact, Sadat was taking a completely rejectionist position, saying nothing about the rights of Palestinians when he went along with the U.S. and the world position on this. Well, the issue of rejectionism also arose, and it arose by the mid-1970s. In the mid-1970s, the international consensus on this matter shifted. It shifted towards a non-rejectionist position, meaning acceptance of Israel's rights to peace and security and territorial integrity and everything else that was written into UN 242, but extending similar rights to the Palestinians. So by mid-1970s, the world position was that there should be two states. There are two claimants to national self-determination. Each should have a state. Israel within its pre-June 1967 borders, the Palestinians within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That issue, that changed things. A series of UN resolutions came along essentially saying that. That issue came to a head too in January 1976. In January 1976, the leading Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, what are called the confrontation states, the ones right on the border, they brought to the United Nations Security Council a resolution calling for a settlement in exactly these terms. It incorporated all of UN 242, the rights of all states in the region to live in peace and security within secure and territorial boundaries, et cetera, but it said there should be a Palestinian state alongside of Israel in the territories from which Israel would withdraw, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That, as I say, was put forth by the leading Arab states. That was openly supported by the PLO, according to the Israeli delegation. It was actually prepared by the PLO, but in any event, it was publicly supported by them. It was supported by Europe. It was supported by Russia and its satellites. It was supported by the Third World. It was about as close to a unanimous declaration as you can get. It was vetoed by the United States. And that ended that. Actually, a similar resolution came to the Security Council in 1980, and it was once again vetoed by the United States. Well, at that point, the U.S. was off the spectrum in two respects. One, in opposing full withdrawal, having changed its earlier position, and two, in maintaining its rejectionism. The rest of the world had shifted from rejectionism. The U.S. maintained it. And in fact, it was then basically the U.S. and Israel versus the world, as it has remained. Now, the history of these two events is kind of interesting and tells us a lot about the society in which we live. These facts are essentially unknown in the United States. They're down the memory hole. Nobody mentions them. They're never reported in the stories about Middle East diplomacy. They're not part of what's called the peace process. They're down what Orwell called memory hole. And the U.S. is quite unique in that. It's interesting to look at the rest of the world. So take, say, Yitzhak Rabin, current Prime Minister of Israel, who was Israeli ambassador in Washington at the time of Sadat's proposal. He's written memoirs. In those memoirs, he describes Sadat's 1971 proposal as a famous milestone on the road to peace and a bold venture and an act of major importance. That's the point of view from the Israelis. In the United States, it doesn't exist. Try and find a reference to it outside of something I've written, or some arcane scholarly monograph which lists dates and numbers. As to the January 1976 resolution, that's just gone. You can't even find it in the footnotes of scholarly monographs. It is out. Just the wrong story. Obviously, it was of great importance. Here was a case where the major Arab states, the PLO, and the rest of the world joined in calling for a diplomatic settlement. It was blocked by the U.S. veto. Well, that's issue number two. With the Security Council out of it because of the U.S. veto, the issue shifted to the General Assembly, where there is technically no veto, but if the United States votes against something, given its power, that's equivalent to a veto. And in fact, the issue came up annually at the winter meeting of the General Assembly. It was almost never reported here. And year after year, the vote was about the same. The last such vote was in December 1990, 144 to 2, the usual 2. And so it goes back. Well, okay, here we have, that's the true story of the peace process. The true story of the peace process is that every move towards a diplomatic settlement was simply blocked by the United States, which has overwhelming power, and it could veto anything in the Security Council. It could vote alone with Israel. Sometimes they picked up some other country, Dominica or something, but it's basically unanimous in the General Assembly, but it doesn't matter. The U.S. vote, something passes 151 to 1 in this General Assembly, as it commonly does. If the U.S. happens to be the one, it's finished, it's vetoed. Also, it's out of history, so it's not reported, and it's gone from history, because having power means controlling history as well. It means controlling the doctrinal system, controlling the way history is perceived. That's what power is, and the United States does have overwhelming power. Anyway, if you bother to look at the records, that's the actual history, though of course not the reported history. Well, that's a wrong story down the memory hole. That's two issues that have been at stake. There's actually a third issue, an interesting one. The third issue is the right to resist military occupation. Is there a right to resist military occupation? So if your country is occupied, you have the right to resist, say. That issue comes up constantly. And it became significant in the Israel-Arab conflict in December 1987 when the Intifada broke out, the Palestinian uprising in the territories. It was not particularly violent, incidentally, but the Intifada, which broke out in December 1987, why did it break out? Well, again, I'll return to Danny Rubenstein, who's the leading Israeli commentator on it in the press. He described the Intifada as the result of sheer accumulation of endless humiliation and casually committed brutalities that had been going on for years and years. It's quite a horrifying record, mostly suppressed in the United States because the United States supports it and in fact pays for it. Extensively reported in the Israeli press, which to its credit has given quite an accurate picture of what in fact happened. Well, that issue came to a head, as I say, in December 1987, and in fact, that issue had already, a year earlier, been raised in the United Nations, not particularly in relation to Israel at the time. What they were really thinking about was South Africa. An important resolution came to the United Nations General Assembly in 1986. It was a resolution on terrorism. You remember that in the mid-'80s, terrorism was the leading issue, the biggest story, the greatest plague in history and so on. So the United Nations addressed it and had a resolution which condemned terrorism in all its forms and all its manifestations, a very strong condemnation of terrorism. It passed 153 to 2, usual 2, United States and Israel. One country, Honduras, abstained, so it was maybe they were sick that day or something. So it was essentially unanimous with the usual 2 in opposition. Why should the United States oppose a resolution on terrorism? The United States was leading the pack on denouncing terrorism. Well, very simple. There was one paragraph in there which was unacceptable to the United States. That paragraph said that nothing in this resolution undermines the right of people to struggle against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation. What people had in the back of their minds was South Africa. The United States doesn't agree with that. The United States does not agree that people have the right to struggle against racist and colonial regimes and foreign military occupation. It doesn't agree because, to a large extent, the United States supports those racist and colonial regimes and foreign military occupations, and therefore recognizes no right to resist them. Israel as well. The United States and Israel, therefore, voted alone against this resolution. Well, again, that's the wrong story, so it was never reported, and it's out of history, except that it happened. Well, as I say, that became important with regard to the Israel-Arab conflict a year later, when the Intifada broke out. The official U.S. view on the Intifada is, as the State Department put it, that it is terror against the State of Israel. And that's come up repeatedly, too, at the UN. So, for example, there was a tax resistant, well, there's a middle-class town on the West Bank called Beit Sahur, which, as its participation in the Intifada, simply entered into tax resistance, completely nonviolent resistance, just refused to pay taxes to the occupation authorities. Israel reacted to that with considerable brutality. I don't accept that. Came to the United Nations Security Council, which condemned the Israeli reaction, or would have condemned it, except that the U.S. vetoed it. That was December 1989, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I should say the United States is far in the lead in veto of Security Council resolutions since the late 60s. Nobody's even close. And quite often they are on issues of this kind. That's out of history, too. You can't find that anywhere, but it's true. That wasn't the only resolution that the United States vetoed at that session. The United States also vetoed two resolutions vetoed one in the Security Council, voted alone with Israel in the General Assembly, against resolutions condemning the U.S. invasion of Panama. And it also voted alone with Israel against a General Assembly resolution calling on all countries to observe international law. The reason for that was that the oblique reference was to the World Court ruling, which called on the United States to terminate its military attack on unlawful use of force, as they put it, against Nicaragua. And of course the U.S. didn't go along with that and wanted to continue that attack. This was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, remember, no Cold War or anything. So that vote was 91-2. And the Beit Sahur vote was another. Okay, that was the U.S. position. We're now up to December 1989. We now have three issues at stake in Middle East diplomacy. One, what does 242 mean? Does it mean full withdrawal or partial withdrawal? Everybody now agrees it means full peace. Two, what about the rejectionism issue? Is the settlement to be based on UN 242 alone, which says nothing about the Palestinians, or 242 plus other resolutions which grant Palestinians national rights? And three, is there resistance to foreign military rule legitimate? And the U.S. position is no on all three, and that's why there's no peace settlement. All of this is highly relevant to the New World Order, notice. Most of what I've been describing is after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Has nothing to do with the Cold War, right? It's the New World Order, all right? And the New World Order, the United States was making it very clear from the beginning that the United States is a lawless and violent state and will do what it feels like, using force to achieve its ends. That's the New World Order. Not very different from the Old World Order, except then the pretexts were different. Another aspect of the New World Order is that all of this is suppressed. Well, as I said, having power means having the power to control doctrine, and that is used very effectively. It's a tribute to the American intellectual community, including the media, that they are able to perform with such extraordinary discipline on such matters, with barely any defection. Any dictator would be very pleased to have a record of the kind I've just reviewed, and it's by no means unique to this case. Well, that's another aspect of the New World Order and, in fact, the society that we live in. So, again, three major issues. Agreement on 242, everybody agreed to that, everybody relevant. The questions were withdrawal, rejectionism, and the right of resistance. All right, let's turn now to the Oslo Accords and see what happened. This collection of agreements that I described last October and September. On the question of withdrawal, the Oslo Accords are explicit. It's partial. So the U.S. won that one. The Oslo Accords are quite explicit that Israel in the long term will maintain control of the parts of the territories that it wants, namely those where there are settlements. Well, the parts that Israel, just exactly what those boundaries are, one doesn't know exactly. But if you draw reasonable boundaries, which Israel probably will do, and certainly is in a position to do, that would mean that Israel would keep about 40% of the Gaza Strip, not the city of Gaza, which it doesn't want to administer, and maybe, half or so of the West Bank. The settlement patterns that are going on right now make that quite explicit. And remember, if there's a settlement going on, it's because you're paying for it. The U.S. gives enormous amounts of aid to Israel and then looks the other way, which means do with it what you feel like, no supervision. It's unique in that respect as well. And it's now being used for extensive settlement programs. This is after the Oslo Accords. So there's extensive settlement around what's called Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now a huge and expanding area, which goes just about to the, if you really look at the boundaries, it goes approximately to the hills above Jericho. That settlement pattern is designed to split the West Bank into two segments, a north part and a south part, so that there can't be any unification. And Greater Jerusalem itself is about 30% of the West Bank. Israel also is carrying out settlements, meaning U.S. support, in the Jordan Valley, up and down the Jordan Valley. You put that together, probably comes to about half. In fact, Israel already has controls about half the territory, and that's where the settlement programs are going. So there's going to be some form of, notice that this means pretty much the Alon plan, if it's implemented. Israeli army will leave Gaza City, and it will leave Nablus, and let the people there administer their own affairs in some fashion if they can, but it'll maintain the resources of the occupied territories, the water, which is crucially important. Israel takes about 5/6 of the water of the West Bank and uses it for itself. In the Gaza Strip, which is basically a desert, the Israeli settlements around Gush Katif are a major agricultural area. They produce about half of Israel's tomatoes for export, flowers, strawberries, and other things. They use most of the water, as Israel's leading military correspondent, Zev Schiff, put it. Israel is stealing Gaza's water for these purposes and will continue to. There are big tourist hotels. It's a fancy tourist place which have artificial lakes and so on and so forth. There's no indication that any of that's going to change. In fact, all of that is being, placed more firmly in place right now. Widely discussed in the Israeli press, barely mentioned here, but you can see it on the ground and so on. Okay, that's withdrawal. Exactly what the borders will be, you can't be certain, but you can tell what the plans are from looking at the settlement proposals, and that's the U.S. and Israel deciding what they want to do, and the withdrawal will be partial along the lines of the traditional Israeli Alon plan. What about the second point, rejectionism? Well, there it's explicit. The long-term settlement, not the short-term, is in terms of UN 242 alone. No other resolutions. No resolutions that refer to Palestinian rights, which means pure rejectionism. And that's the final settlement. There's nothing in there about any Palestinian rights. Israel may decide to call whatever territories it hands over to Palestinian administration. It could decide to call them a state for cosmetic reason, but there is no intention to let them have any form of independence or authority, and that's entirely recognized. So on point 2, the United States, again, won. What about the third point, the question of right of resistance? That didn't enter into the Declaration of Principles, but it did enter into the exchange of notes. The Arafat-Rabin exchange, if you look at it, Arafat gave a host of concessions, crucially ending the Intifada, meaning no further resistance to Israeli military rule, which is incidentally to continue. The Israeli military rule will continue in whatever parts of the territories Israel continues to control, but there can't be any resistance to it. In return for those concessions, Yitzhak Rabin basically said nothing. He said, we agree to talk to you, no concessions. Well, that was the exchange of notes, and it means that on all three issues, the United States got exactly what it wanted, United States and Israel. There is also nothing in the agreements about other issues, about the Palestinian diaspora, about the right of compensation, all sorts of other UN resolutions which go back to December 1948, and which the U.S. has in fact voted for, although that's so far down the memory hole that nobody knows about it anymore. Well, end result, complete victory for U.S. rejectionism. It is not only the only place where I would disagree with, say, Thomas Friedman is he said Arafat ran up the white flag, but that's understating it. Actually, the whole world ran up the white flag. The whole world, because remember, there was unanimity on these issues, on all three of them, in fact, and everybody gave up. The U.S. got its position. Israel's committed to nothing, not committed to ending the settlements, and in fact it has been continuing with them, not ending land takeover, no need to end torture, no need to end death squads. All of that continues, which is exactly right. They are not violating the agreements, and you can't accuse them of that because the agreements allow it. Period. There's one last component, namely the secret talks on security. I mentioned that it was revealed after the agreements that there had been secret talks on security going on. These are quite interesting. The secret talks on security were organized by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is the leading learned society in the United States, in Boston. Very, nice, old-fashioned, WASPy place. The thing was under the auspices of an American professor, a well-known Quaker pacifist, in fact, who's a Middle East dove. What did they deal with? Who was involved? Well, there were three Israeli representatives. One was a man from the Mossad, sort of like the CIA. Another was the Shlomo Gazit, who's the former head of Israeli military intelligence and military administrator for the West Bank. And the third was Ev Schiff, the man I mentioned before, the Israeli military historian who has very close intelligence ties. They're the three Israeli people, and then there were their PLO counterparts, similar guys on the PLO side. And what were they dealing with? Well, they were dealing with security, but security for Israel, period. This was all discussed at some length in the Israeli press. There was no talk about security for Palestinians. Nothing about the Palestinians who are under Israeli army control, or the border guards, or the settlers who've been rampaging as they have been. Nothing about torture. None of that stuff. These are not issues. Again, that expresses the profound racism of American attitudes towards these things. I should say when this stuff came out, it was all hailed in the United States as a grand humanitarian gesture. And the American Academy was applauded, and the liberal Boston Globe was talking about how great it is. Well, yeah, it's great. Security for Israelis, nothing for Palestinians. That, in fact, expresses the view that we have. The details of what were discussed are quite simple. The PLO is to bring armed forces in, basically foreign armed forces. So, the legions of the Jordanian army who happen to be Palestinian in origin, and they're to be brought in to control the population in the areas that the PLO is to administer, the refugee camps. And Israel is going to arm them sufficiently so they'll be able to control those people. Now that means that Israel is shifting from the former method of control of the territories to a much more traditional method. The traditional method of imperial occupiers has always been to use native forces. The idea that you use your own forces to control another country is outlandish. So, for example, the United States controls the Caribbean basin, Caribbean countries in Central America, but it doesn't use its own military forces unless things are really in duress. It uses local mercenaries, local forces trained and armed by the United States, like the Guatemalan generals who carry out genocide in the highlands, or the Salvadoran security forces who massacre tens of thousands of people, and so on, or the Haitian military, most of whom were trained in Fort Benning, Georgia, and so on. Those are the guys who are supposed to run it. The imperial power stays in the background. They don't want to use their own forces. And that's standard. When the British ran India, for example, the British forces were very thin. About 90% of the forces that controlled India were Indians, Indian sepoys. In southern Africa, say, in southern Rhodesia under the white racist regimes, the worst killers and torturers, the ones who really ran the place, were blacks. The Selous Scouts, for example. Russia in Eastern Europe didn't use Russian. Occasionally they'd use Russian troops, like, Russian troops would go into Hungary in 1956 and so on, but that was rare. For the most part, Eastern Europe was run by local mercenaries, Polish troops, Czech troops, Hungarian troops, under with a sprinkling of Russians in the background and the iron fist in case anything got out of control. Same in China, the Tiananmen Square massacre. China brought in Chinese troops from the provinces to control the demonstrators in the city. Israel does the same thing in southern Lebanon, controls southern Lebanon mostly with local mercenaries. That's the normal approach, and now Israel and the United States are intending to shift to that normal approach. Actually, you could say the same about the Germans in occupied Europe. You look at the Nazis in occupied Europe, for the most, there were exceptions, but for the most part, they used local mercenaries to run them. Ukrainians in the Ukraine, French in France, and so on. That's the normal pattern of imperial rule, whoever it is, and it was kind of stupid for Israel not to do that in the first place. Now they're going to do it, and that moves right into the normal patterns. Well, I should say that all of this is quite well understood at the top. So Yitzhak Rabin, who's the Israeli foreign minister in Israel, said that he thought this was a good idea because the PLO troops who are being brought in, they're Palestinian in origin, but basically foreign troops with little roots in the community, he said they will deal with the Palestinians without problems from the High Court of Justice, without problems from B'Tselem, which is a human rights group, and without problems from all sorts of bleeding hearts and all kinds of fathers and mothers. The idea is that when Israeli troops are there, you get all these bleeding hearts and fathers and mothers who don't like all the atrocities that the Israeli troops are carrying out. But now we can forget about that. We'll just have straight foreign killers come in and they'll handle the thing right with no fuss. That's kind of reasonable. That's the honest reaction. And the U.S. reaction is interesting too, namely great applause for this triumph of humanitarianism and pacifism, which again shows how deep the rejectionist and racist assumptions are in the United States. Since Palestinians are not human beings, they have no rights, something which is very deeply rooted in our culture. So the outcome is basically, I'd go into more details if you like, but the outcome essentially is the United States won a total victory. And the racist assumptions are established, so firmly established that nobody even notices, which is the ultimate form of indoctrination. And again, it is not the PLO that capitulated, it's the world. We may ask why the PLO capitulated. It's getting late, but I'll talk about that if you like, but they certainly did. Why did it happen now, not before? Well, let me end with that. That really does have to do with changes in the world order. I remember I mentioned that the last UN vote on the matter was December 1990. That was right before the Gulf War. The Gulf War established very clearly that the United States intends to rule that region by force. Nobody's going to get in the way. Diplomatic opportunities were blocked. It was going to be done by violence, in which we reign supreme. Nobody comes close. And the world understood that. In the United States, maybe it's not too well understood, but the rest of the world understands it very well. At that point, Europe simply backed off. They said, okay, you guys, this is your turf. We're not going to interfere. No more diplomacy. From now on, we simply implement your rejectionist policies, period. So no more votes in the UN, no more European declarations. They'll just implement U.S. rejectionist programs, which is indeed what Norway did in these agreements. As for the rest of the world, the United States, the Soviet Union's gone. Now, in fact, it's just a client state, so it does whatever we tell it, maybe even more loyal than Britain, if that's possible to imagine. The third world is in total disarray. I mean, in part because of the economic catastrophes of the last years, but in part because the disappearance of the Soviet Union, whatever you think about it, like say it's worse than the Nazis, whatever you believe, its existence created a certain space for non-alignment. The existence of two powers in a bipolar world, whatever they may be, makes it possible to take a somewhat neutralist position. When one of those two powers is gone, so is non-alignment and neutralism, meaning everything is now under the feet of the other power. It's exactly what the third world understands, one of the reasons why there's such enormous despair throughout the third world, even in conservative circles, incidentally, as reflected, for example, in the South Commission. Again, nobody talks about that here, but it's very visible and it's quite understandable. So they're out of the game. As to the Arab world, it's just a total disaster. The PLO, well, I think the comment in the Financial Times that this was a desperate last throw, what was his words, a desperate last throw by a weakened leader, is basically correct. There was plenty of opposition to the PLO developing in the territories, open calls for Arafat to resign, a lot of anger and antagonism about the corruption and the incompetence of the PLO. That had always been true. I mean, I heard that myself in West Bank villages years ago, although in those days people still said, well, you know, rotten as they are, they're our representatives. By early last year, that was beginning to end, and there were open calls for finding a democratic alternative and so on. It was apparently Arafat's last, effort to salvage something. Israel recognized that. They recognized that they're dealing with a weakened leader who will capitulate, and so the agreement reached. Well, what about the consequences? Will the consequences be an improvement in the living conditions of the Palestinians? That's conceivable. It's also conceivable that when the Bosnians capitulate, there will be an improvement, like they won't be shelled anymore and murdered. It was when the Russians pulled out of Hungary after invading it in 1956, there was an improvement. The Hungarians lived under a Russian-imposed tyranny, but they lived somewhat better than when Russian tanks were in there, in fact, considerably better. So in that sense, there may be an improvement. When the victors win their victory, they sometimes leave things, a little better off than when they're really beating everyone up. The prospects for the territories are that there'll be a certain kind of development, but it'll be the sort of development that takes place essentially in the Caribbean basin. Super cheap labor, opportunities for export of pollution, ways of undercutting jobs and wages for people in the home country, so you can undercut U.S. wages by shifting work over to northern Mexico or El Salvador or Haiti. That's part of the way in which you fight the class war in the United States. Similar things are very likely in Israel. There'll be probably an increase in the quite significant and growing inequality in Israel. But plenty of people benefit, rich industrialists on both, financiers. Elements of the third world community also will benefit, like the rich Haitians and Salvadorans. That's likely what's happening there. What's likely to happen there. There's a lot to say about the background reasons. I won't talk about that because it's getting too late, unless you're interested. But as for the problems, in my opinion, I agree with Danny Rubenstein, the Israeli journalist. The problems are exactly as before. Nothing fundamental has changed. The problems may be more difficult to deal with because after, just like they were problems of, say, freedom in Eastern Europe, were more difficult to deal with after the Russian victory in Hungary and then their pullout. But they're there. And in fact, that's true of most of the world. To proceed to elaborate that would be to give a broader picture of the New World Order, of which, in my opinion, this is a rather revealing microcosm. Okay? Thanks. If whoever is managing those lights could somehow manage to turn them down a bit so I could see people, which I can't do at the moment, I'll call on people to raise questions. Otherwise I can't do it because all I see is a black thing in front of me. I assume there's people out there, but is there a way to turn down the lights a bit? Or can I move somewhere where they won't blind me or something? How about if I move over? Is that better? Oh, okay, now I can see better. Oh, I see there's actually two mics. Yeah. A lot of people? Oh, good. Okay, so, yeah, why don't we just alternate at the mics?
Hi, Professor Chomsky, and thanks for the talk. And I'm sure that I agree with, everything that you say about what's right and wrong in the world. But, my impression is that most American people that I would talk to don't really think that there's really much, point to talking about right and wrong in international affairs, that it's just dog eat dog. And there is no right and wrong. It's just the rule of the strongest anyway. So, considering that, any of us that want to do any political work, have to deal with that. And so just, speaking facts
Yeah, I understand.
is not going to persuade anybody. How do you see your role
Right.
in the midst of that?
Well, I guess I see it because I don't accept your assumption. I just don't think it's true. I mean, I don't have any reason to believe I'm more moral than anybody else is. And in fact, my feeling, and I don't have my finger on the pulse of the population, but my feeling is everybody's pretty much the way you and I are, and everybody else is. You don't like to see atrocities go on. You don't want to participate in them. You allow them to go on either because you don't know about them, or because you think there's no other way to do it, or you're deluged with propaganda about how wonderful we are and what great benefactors and so on. And I think if these veils are torn away, people don't like what they see. Furthermore, a lot of other people agree with me about this. Crucially, everybody in power agrees with me. That's a rather important fact. See, and it's not just in this country, it's in every other country too. You might look at the historical record, try to find some country, or just to keep to the United States, some point in American history, where any leadership group said, look, we want something, and we're going to take it, because we're powerful enough to take it, and we can beat up everybody who's in the way, so we're just going to take it, because it's good for us. I mean, if you can find an example of that, I'd like to see it. I've never seen it in U.S. history. I've never seen it in the Soviet Union. I never saw it in Nazi Germany. I never saw it in the history of Britain. In fact, I've never seen it anywhere. And I haven't read everything, but I've read a lot. And that is simply not done. Well, why isn't it done? Why through the whole history of the British Empire, which was doing horrifying things, did you have everybody talking about how noble they were? And what great benefits they were giving all the subject peoples in the world, and how they were helping them up, and so on and so forth.
Well, the rulers can't rule on their own. They have to rule somebody.
Yeah, I mean, they themselves want to see themselves as doing well, and they know that they better not tell people the truth. And I suppose they know that for a very simple reason. They figure, look, if we tell them the truth, they're not going to follow us. So therefore, we'll lie to them. Now, they may not be consciously lying, because, you tend to, it's very easy to come to believe what's convenient to believe. So maybe Stalin thought he was a great benefactor. I don't know. And it's not really important. But the point is, try to find a case where, see, if you're right, then you'd expect leadership groups to do the easy thing. The easy thing is to tell the truth. Lies are much harder. You get caught up in them. They're hard to invent. They're exposed.
Well, you said that they're telling the truth more and more lately, that they're being more honest about imperialism.
About the past. Yeah, about the past, they're sort of, the pretexts are basically gone. However, if you look at where the truths are told, they're in things like what I quoted. A document, an internal document, which I read, and I don't know if anybody else here read it, but, the number of people who saw it is extremely small. You want to find another place where people are telling the truth, have a look at the next to last issue of Foreign Policy. Not the current one, but the one right before it. That's one of the two main foreign policy journals. The lead article in that journal in that issue was written by two leading foreign... Can you hear me when I stand here? Yeah. Two leading foreign policy specialists, Christopher Lane of the Cato Institute, a very conservative institute, and a guy named Benjamin Schwartz of the Rand Corporation. And it's a very revealing article. What they say is, look, the Cold War's over. The game's finished. Foreign policy elites are going to have to come clean. And when they come clean, what they're going to say is what we've always known, but we've never said, namely that U.S. foreign policy is an attempt to gain control of markets and resources and world power, and to get rid of anybody who's in our way, and to do it by force because we have force, and so on. And then they end up saying, they say it's ironic, but this is a Marxist or perhaps a Leninist view of imperialism. That's ironic. Okay, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. And now that the clouds are lifting and, you can't carry out the old game, we might as well tell it straight. Well, of course, they're talking to the foreign policy elite. Okay, guys who teach in Harvard and that sort of thing. So they can say it. But to the general population, nobody's saying that. To the general population, it's all about how magnificent we are and how we're carrying the torch of freedom and justice and, humanitarian missions and so on. Well, okay, if they, why? If your assumption, I don't know if my assumption about people is right or your assumption is right. All I can say is everyone in power, everyone in a position of doctrinal or managerial or other authority, who I know, I don't know of an exception, either in the United States or in any other country, has not agreed with you. They have felt that it is necessary and important to delude people about what's happening. And I think that's important evidence. Final bit of evidence that's relevant is what public attitudes are like. We know a lot about that. Public attitudes tend to be very different from elite attitudes. This is a very heavily polled country, mainly because business wants to keep its, wants to know what people are thinking. You have to know how to propagandize them. Most of the polls are done for business. But there's tons of material, and it's extremely intriguing. And you find that elite attitudes are simply uncorrelated with public attitudes. So take, say, the Vietnam War, huge issue. Elite attitudes are quite narrow. You go all the way to the critical end. Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, the most critical guy you can think of in the academic world or so on. And they say, look, the war was a mistake. We got in over our heads, cost us too much, tried to do the right thing, but, it didn't work, and so on. That's the critical end. Then you get to the hawks, and they say, we should have fought it harder, we would have won. That's the spectrum. You turn to the public, and you find something totally different. From the time that the polls really began to be taken, around 1970, up until today, it's about 70% of the public says the war was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. 70% of the public. Now, those are people who never heard anyone say that. Because nobody said it, but that's what they think in their own hearts. Now,
probably not so clear with respect to Israel and Palestine, though.
Well, with respect to Israel and Palestine, polls have consistently shown that the U.S. public is about 2-to-1 in favor of a Palestinian state, even though they've never heard anybody say it. Because, you ask people, well, okay, there's these Palestinians over here, do they have a right to have their own mayors? People say, yeah. Okay. It's just that the public is excluded from the public arena. Now, if you ask, does the public really care about these issues? Well, okay, maybe they don't. Like, they obviously don't care enough about the Palestinian issue to bother pressing that. As a result, elites can do what they want. Okay. However, what it illustrates, and you can go on with this, and remember that these are results where people have never heard anything. They're coming to that conclusion by themselves, basically. That's true on issue after issue, including domestic issues, I should say. And it's important, and it helps explain why, across the board, elite groups are so strongly opposed to democracy. The hatred of democracy is passionate. There's a certain conception of democracy that's acceptable, namely formal democracy, in which you show up every once in a while and push a lever and then let your betters run things, and you go back and watch the Super Bowl. That's the official definition of democracy, and it's pretty explicit, I should say. But the idea that people should actually participate in public affairs, that arouses fury. You want to see an example of it? Take a look at the debate over NAFTA, which was extremely interesting in that respect. Though this was a big issue for business corporations. The business world was unanimous about NAFTA. They considered it very important. As a result, the press was 100% in favor of it. I couldn't find any probably if you look at the whole press, you'll find some deviation, but it's about as close to 100% as I've ever seen. And furthermore, fanatic about it. They really got hysterical at the end. So you get towards the end, and the way they got hysterical is, and the public, meanwhile, stayed opposed. The public, of the parts that had an opinion, a lot of people didn't have an opinion, it was about 2-to-1 opposed, right through, When you got to the end, the last month, I reviewed the press, the national press in the last month, and it was extremely interesting. The thing that they really got hysterical about was that labor was lobbying for its own views. Okay, I don't know if you remember that, but there was all, from the president on down, it was all kind of hysterical shrieking about, the raw muscle and the naked power and, labor pleading and this and that. And this is true way at the left, like Anthony Lewis. You'll not find a more pro-labor guy in the press. He was talking about how, labor's crude, threatening tactics and, their backwardness and unenlightened attitude and their fear of foreigners. He just went berserk. Well, what was happening? a sector, first of all, corporate lobbying was outdid labor lobbying by, I don't know, like 50-1 probably. There was no complaint about corporate lobbying, because that's just taken for granted. That's like the air you breathe. I mean, the government's supposed to be run for the interests of corporations. So if they lobby for their interests, who bothers talking about it? On the other hand, labor, which represents some popular segment, if they begin to lobby, to ask their representatives to do what they want, that's a horror. The society's collapsing. These guys are supposed to be watching the Super Bowl. They're not supposed to be out there asking their representatives to do something. So the press simply went berserk. Well, that reflects very dramatically the hatred of democracy, which is really passionate. And you see it in moments like that. And what's particularly interesting to me is that nobody notices it. Like, try to find somebody who makes this comment. I think this comment's transparent. I don't know if you think so. But it looks to me like a transparently obvious observation about the educated classes in the United States and the way they react to an attempt to exercise democratic rights. They go berserk. And what that reflects is you're not allowed to do that. Well, I think going back to your original question, they sort of know at some level that you better not let the population express itself or find out things. Anyhow, whether that assumption is right or wrong, I should say that we should accept it anyhow. Because I think there's a lot of evidence that it's right, this kind of evidence. If it's wrong, well, okay, we try and we fail. If it's right and we don't do anything, we've lost a tremendous opportunity. So either way, you proceed in the same fashion. Yeah.
I had 3 brief little questions. One was in regards to the Zapatista uprising recently. Mm-hmm. I was wondering what you think, how you rebut to this comment. I was discussing it with someone, actually a couple people, and I had mentioned how some of the Zapatista demands were they wanted better treatment from the multinationals down there, in which case I was replied back to that, they had nothing before, they should be grateful that the multinationals were there in the first place. That was one question. Question number 2, what do you, the Soviet Union, I felt, posed somewhat of an alternative world view of things if you were a ham radio listener. You would get a different angle on the stories. What do you think are some of the outside factors, i.e. the arms race, that type of thing that brought the Soviet Union down? And number 3, I feel from what I watch with the media, all right, I'm trying to go fast.
I better mark these things down because I'm going to
forget. The third one was that I feel from the media, I see somewhat of a wave of what I would consider anti-black propaganda. Similar how in the Gulf War we saw a lot of anti-Arab, not even anti-Saddam Hussein, but actually anti-Arab propaganda. And actually right here in the Alt newspaper, the so-called alternative, I noticed a cartoon that I think is at the least to say insensitive towards African Americans. And do you feel there is anti-black propaganda? And if so, where is it leading? And an adjunct question is someone who wants to somewhat follow in your footsteps or at least carry on the torch of what you're doing, what do you think would be a good thing to carry on with as far as higher education is concerned? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Well, with regard to the Zapatistas and the multinationals, the way that the Zapatista uprising, this southern Mexico Chiapas uprising of natives, the way it's mostly portrayed here is that, these Mayan Indians were really getting it in the neck. They were the poorest part of Mexican society, so okay, they rose up. The fact of the matter is they had overwhelming support in Mexico. That's one of the reasons the government backed off instead of just using overt violence to repress them. It was just getting too much support all over Mexico. So it's really a large part of the population of Mexico. Now, when you say, well, they didn't have anything before, now at least they got the multinationals, things have happened in Mexico. There's 10 years of what's called an economic miracle following U.S. recommendations, neoliberal recommendations. They've got the multinationals, and there's been an economic miracle, but look what it's meant. The economic miracle has meant that wages have dropped by probably 40 or 50%. Malnutrition has vastly increased. Poverty's increased. Mexico, which used to be a subsistence, have its own food supplies, is now a food importer. We can go on with this. Meanwhile, there's plenty of new billionaires. The stock market is doing great, except that about 8,000 people own virtually all the stocks, half of them foreigners. So what's happening is the society is being very radically polarized. rather like the United States, but it's a much more vulnerable society, so the polarization is much sharper. It's also going on here. And you can say, yeah, well, at least they have the multinationals. Yeah, sure. And what they have is what I just described. And that's what the multinationals will increase. The multinationals will increase the polarization. There was enormous opposition to NAFTA in Mexico. It was virtually unreported here. And just about every article you read said, well, the Mexicans want NAFTA and the Mexicans want this. And that's true of the Mexicans who were being sampled. If you looked and asked which Mexicans are they quoting, it turned out to be some, banker or, manager of some big multinational firm. Or half the time it turned out to be American investors who were the Mexicans. But if you looked at the Mexicans, like if the people of Mexico are Mexicans, well, there were big demonstrations all over the place against NAFTA. The biggest non-governmental union, I have a governmental union, it's kind of like unions in Russia, but the non-governmental union was against NAFTA, the environmental groups were against it, the peasant groups were against it. The Mexican bishops, who are not a particularly radical bunch, came out with a strong condemnation of it. All of that was suppressed here. And the reason is because they all expected to continue the polarization. They expected to drive lots of people off the land, to reduce manufacturing jobs. During this economic miracle, manufacturing employment has declined in Mexico. And what there is, working for foreign maquiladoras. That's expected to continue, so sure, they're against it. Is there another development model for Mexico? Absolutely. All you have to do is look at the economists who were excluded from the debate. See, it's kind of interesting. Actually, it's been pointed out that when you read about economists here, you read the papers and what the economists thought about NAFTA and the models, turned out they were all enthusiastic about it. Well, there's a very simple reason for that. The only economists who were allowed in were the ones who were enthusiastic about NAFTA. There are plenty of them who weren't. And in fact, there's something even more striking. There's a correlation, a negative correlation, between knowledge of Mexico among economists and participation in the debate. So if you take a look at the economists who deal with Mexico, they were out of the debate. There's quite a few of them, but they were never allowed in. They weren't in the New York Times, and they weren't in the Brookings Institute conferences or anything else, because they knew something about Mexico. And they were describing what was going to happen. The guys who were allowed in are guys playing games with models. They'd never heard of Mexico. It could have been Antarctica for all they know. And the models are largely irrelevant. Everybody knows the models don't work. They're based on all sorts of totally arbitrary assumptions and so on. But they fixed up the numbers so they came out with the right results. So they were allowed in. Well, the economists who know about Mexico had reasons for being opposed, thinking it's going to harm the majority of Mexicans as well as the majority of Americans. Fine, that's what they have to wear. And they gave alternatives. They proposed substantive, concrete alternatives, as did the critics of NAFTA. So, for example, the labor lobbying that people were screaming about, I don't know how many of you ever read the labor material, but almost nobody saw it. But if you looked at it, it gave quite constructive, substantive alternatives for ways of getting a trade agreement that would be beneficial to people on both sides. Well, that never even entered discussion. It wasn't only labor. Congress has an Office of Technology Assessment, which is a neutral, independent research outfit in Congress that kind of, does analysis of things. They came out with a big report on NAFTA, very critical, also proposing alternatives. In fact, it was very similar to the labor report and to many of the reports of economists who know something about Mexico. Try to find a reference to it. That's not a far-out organization. That's Congress's own Office of Technology Assessment. If you can find a reference to that, I'd like to see it outside of things that I wrote, 2 or 3 other people. Well, okay, just the wrong story. So what are these Zapatistas, the answer to your friend's question is there are a lot of alternatives. They just don't satisfy American business interests or the interests of the Mexican super rich, which are linked to them. On the question of the Russians and the arms race which brought them down, here we have to distinguish between truth and propaganda. It's true in a sense that the arms race brought the Russians down, but it didn't have much to do with Reagan. It had to do a lot with Kennedy. You take a look at Russian economic development, and it was doing quite, forget the tyranny and all that stuff. That's another point. We're talking about straight economic development, economic growth, Up till up till the First World War, Russia was a deeply impoverished part of the Third World. In fact, it was declining relative to the West, right up to it's all through all of Eastern Europe almost, but crucially Russia. From 1915, Bolshevik Revolution, around after they sort of recovered from the war, up until 1950, there was a very rapid increase relative to the West. And that's just what the West was worried about, that they were, from the point of view of a third world country, the development model was extremely successful, much more successful than those that we ran. I mean, we run development models in the third world too, places like Brazil and so on, and they're disastrous. But this one was really working. And whereas people in the West are very brainwashed and indoctrinated, in the third world, people could see these things. And American leaders knew it, and that's one of the reasons they were worried about Russia. Well, from about 1950 to 1960, it kind of leveled off. Then it starts to decline from relative to the West. Relative to the West, the Soviet Union begins to decline somewhat in the 1960s. And it continues in that way until 1989, when it went to free fall. I mean, now it's right back where it was in 1913. So the U.S. won the war. They're back in the third world. They're again an impoverished, deeply impoverished third world country, which is what we wanted. Now, what does the arms race have to do with this? And in fact, what happened in the early 60s? Well, one thing that happened was the Kennedy arms buildup. Kennedy, who was a super, Eisenhower had kept arms spending relatively, it was high, but it didn't shoot through the roof. Kennedy came in 1960 on a program very similar to Reagan's program in 1980. The liberal Democrats were attacking Eisenhower as a wimp who was letting the Russians get ahead of us, and they were falling behind, and they're taking over the world, and this and that and the other stuff, all kind of hysteria. And they said, we got to have a huge missile, we have to have a huge buildup, there's this missile gap, they got all those missiles already to destroy us. In fact, they had no missile, they had 4 missiles, which were sitting somewhere on an open airfield, it turned out. They probably were not even operational. There was indeed a missile gap way in our favor. The Kennedy people knew this and went ahead with another huge expansion of the military. Khrushchev at that time made an offer to cut back Russian military forces, offensive Russian military forces, by about a third, and he asked the United States to reciprocate. That was known. What was not known is that he actually did it. American intelligence reports have since come out saying, he actually carried out those reductions from 1960 through 63, and Washington refused to reciprocate, went ahead with the arms race. All right, in the middle of this comes along the Cuban Missile Crisis, which revealed to the Russians, they already knew it in some level, but it really revealed very dramatically that they were totally vulnerable. The United States was way ahead of them in military capacity. All right, Russia's got its hawks too. The generals and those guys took power, and they launched into a huge military buildup to try to catch up with the Americans. Meanwhile, the American one kept up too, and so it continued into the 70s, and that did exhaust them. They're a poor third world country, and they did not have the capacity to compete with rich, powerful countries in terms of weapons development. So that was presumably some factor, how big a factor we can't judge, in the stagnation of the Soviet Union. I think there were other factors, but that was one. This is only talking now about the economic side, not about the political tyranny or anything else. What happened in the 80s was almost irrelevant. By that time, this game was essentially finished. Now, should you be proud of that? Well, depends what you think the best outcome is. If the best outcome was for Russia to proceed through a series of social and political reforms, gradually dropping the tyrannical aspects of the society, allowing dissidents to speak, in fact, exactly the kinds of things that were going on, and probably would have continued. And meanwhile, to shift over its economy towards something more constructive, not just military and so on. If that's what you think, then this was a horrible thing to happen. On the other hand, if you think, Russia should be returned back to the third world, it should have the consequences that have happened since 1989. There's a UNESCO report that just came out on Eastern Europe since the American victory in 1989, which describes the human consequences of the collapse of the economies. It estimates that in the Soviet Union, there's about 500,000 people dying every year as a result of the collapse of the economy. Big achievement. You should feel proud of that. In Poland, which is supposed to be the success story, the number of suicides has increased by about a third. Death rates have gone up all throughout the region. Yeah, okay, famous victory, if that's what you want. And in fact, most of the region is being returned to a third-world community, exactly where it was. Well, if that's what you want, fine, it's the right thing to do, spend them into disaster. I mean, I think I'd rather myself have seen quite different directions for breaking down the tyrannical system, for breaking down the military expenditures, and so on, and I think those processes were underway. So I don't think that I don't know who we are who won the Cold War, but it wasn't me, at least. In fact, it wasn't the American people, because most of them are suffering from that. In fact, if you look in Russia, just ask yourself, who's triumphant about the end of the Cold War and who's in despair? That tells you something. Who's triumphant about the Cold War? Well, Western elites, privileged elements in the West are very triumphant. They think it's great. Privileged elements in Russia also agree that it's great. Those privileged elements happen to be the old Communist Party. They're the nomenclatura who are now running the businesses for Western corporations. They think it's fantastic. They're richer than they ever were. In fact, there's a recent report reviewing the number of sales of Mercedes-Benz $150,000 limousines in Moscow and New York. Turns out they sell more of them in Moscow. Most of them the old Communist Party hacks who are now running the franchises for the Western businesses. So they're delighted. They think it was great. So the Communist Party won the Cold War. American elites won the Cold War. Did the Third World win the Cold War? They're in total despair. How about the population of Eastern Europe? Huge, amazing numbers of them think that things were better under the old tyranny. They didn't win the Cold War. How about the population of the United States? Well, 75% of the population of the United States think that the future is going to be worse than the present. That is, that their children are not going to live as well as they did. That's never happened in the history of industrial society. That's a plausible judgment because, in fact, the society is polarizing. Real wages have been declining for years. It accelerated in the 80s. This is the first recovery, which has been accompanied by a decline in wages, particularly for blue-collar workers, but even for white-collar workers. That's never happened before. So people are realistic, and the end of the Cold War is part of that. The end of the Cold War makes it possible for, say, GM or other corporations, let's say, which used to have factories here, they can now ship their production over to Eastern Europe, where they can get workers who are well-trained and educated and so on at like 10% the cost of Western workers. Fantastic weapon against the workers in the West who have lost the Cold War. Well, okay, you just take a look at the people who are cheering and the people who are despairing, and you see who won the Cold War and what it was about. Not very hard to figure out. And then you evaluate the actions that were taken, like the arms race, to try to bring about these consequences. As for the anti-black propaganda, yeah, I think it's there, and it's there. I didn't see the cartoons you were talking about, but it seems I see it in another respect, and that's in the crime business. So it's very striking that about 2 or 3 days, there's a big hysteria about crime in the country. And, there ought to be. It's a horrible thing. But have a look at it. Why isn't there crime in my neighborhood? Do the people in my neighborhood have different genes or something? How come it's in downtown Boston, like not in my suburb? Why isn't, how come all the kids in my suburb don't have to be put in boot camps? But in downtown Boston, they'll have to be put in boot camps. So they have different genes. Like if my kids had grown up down there and their kids had grown up in my neighborhood, what would have happened? Well, we know the answer to those questions. It's rather striking that this new crime bill, which, about a 6-fold increase in government repression? Huge increase, very much hailed by the extreme right. That was passed a couple of days after NAFTA. I think there's some symbolism there. In fact, it seems to me it's kind of like the Chiapas rebellion that you mentioned. NAFTA is going to polarize. It's going to harm large segments of American society, probably the majority. There are no plans to do anything about that, except to exhort them to be, responsible for their children or something. But nothing's going to be done about the collapsing American society. In fact, the NAFTA, with its accelerating the transfer of power over to the hands of transnational private corporations, meaning private absolutist power, that's going to undermine democracy and undermine the status of much of the population. That's what it's intended for, and that's what it'll do. What are you going to do with all those people? You know, what are you going to do with all the people who are marginalized? Well, the United States is beginning to look like a third world country. I mean, we're super rich with every possible advantage. We ought to be the richest country in the world. Nobody comes close to us in advantages, but we're not. We have poverty on a scale that's unknown in other industrial countries. The same is true of malnutrition. The same is true of mortality and so on. And it's going to increase because we're in the lead of moving towards a highly polarized third world type society. It's not going to look like Mexico because we're so rich, but that's structural pattern. You're going to have lots of superfluous people. What do you do with them in our third world dependencies? Well, you know, you send out the death squads. So the Brazilian police go rampaging around the streets and they murder children and that sort of thing. Well, okay, we don't quite do it that way yet. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if it comes to that. But we don't do it that way yet. What we do is ram the superfluous population into urban slums, which are concentration camps. Hope is that they just prey on one another, that the social demoralization and disintegration will be such that to just be, you know, they'll take care of each other by being run by criminal gangs or kill each other or something. Sometimes it breaks out, you know, and impinges on the interests of, you know, rich folk. So, okay, we need more jails, more prisons, and so on. What is the racial element in this? Well, it's very clear. There's a very close race-class correlation in the United States. Poor whites are getting hurt too, but disproportionately it's poor people of color, wildly disproportionately. And that's because of a race-class correlation. So yeah, it all comes out. It's a kind of racism, if you like, but I think it's really more class than race in this case. Last comment. What about higher education? What can be done? Well, I think there's a lot to be done in higher education. I mean, higher education is one crucial part of the indoctrination system. Now, we have a whole intricate, complex system of indoctrination, mainly designed at relatively elite elements. You know, people are going to be in decision-making positions. And it's designed to give them certain attitudes and beliefs and a picture of the world and so on and so forth. People who are involved in this system are in a very good position to influence that. Now, you know, that's not going to change the world alone, but it's an important part of it. And it's also, you know, just the kind of people that will be reaching out to the rest of the community. I mean, the whole community needs people, you know, desperately, who will be able to discuss with them what's going on. They don't hear anything. They just hear what's given to them by the propaganda organs. Now, they don't like what's going on, very much dislike what's going on, but they don't hear anything. They have no organization and so on. That's just the kind of role that people ought to play. And in fact, I should say that, you know, it's less likely to happen in real elite universities like Harvard, where the kids come from, you know, upper-class families and they're going off to Wall Street, than it is in state colleges and community colleges and so on, which are kind of a bridge between the general population and sectors of decision-making classes. I imagine a lot of people here have roots in communities, which they wouldn't have in elite universities. Fine, those are really important things to develop. And I think it's critical at this stage if we're going to rebuild and reconstruct some sort of viable democratic system. So I think there's a lot to do in higher education.
Thank you.
Dr. Chomsky, just so we can hear your response, I think we hear you much better with the mic at the podium.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to hear, if you will, a brief analysis, your analysis of what's going on in the old Yugoslavia. In particular, I'd like to know, is there hope for peace there? In particular, what would be a good role for the United States there versus what the U.S. is doing now? What motives, what interest does the U.S. have there? And what should the peace movement in the United States push for in that area of the world?
That's a really important question, and it's a hard one. I haven't written about it, and part of the reason I haven't written about it is I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I think there's a real bind on that one. For example, if the United States were a different kind of country, say like if it was more like Canada, say, then I would personally be in favor of having U.S. forces there under UN command, contributing. We can make, we're the big military power, contributing to what are called peacekeeping operations, which are not very pretty and not very effective, but can do something at least, to reduce the level of atrocities and so on. So like if there were sufficient ground forces, without being a military expert, I suspect that they could, say, end the siege of Sarajevo and similar things elsewhere. It's not going to be done by bombing. That's not going to do anything. On the other hand, the United States is the country that it is. It's not another country. We might like to change it, but it is the country that it is. And as the country that it has a horrible record in military intervention. And it has an incredibly bad military doctrine. I mean, this is, unusual in that the U.S. military doctrine is you use massive force to protect your own soldiers, no matter what the effect on anyone else. Now, you just can't carry out peacekeeping operations under those military doctrines. I mean, those military doctrines lead to things like Somalia. Like, Saudi Arabian troops or Pakistani troops might be, say, giving out food somewhere and in danger, or maybe somebody shoots at them and they don't like it. But if American troops, somebody makes a gesture at them, you bring in helicopter gunships and you kill everybody in sight. That kind of military doctrine doesn't lend itself to peacekeeping operations. And unfortunately, that's the way it is. You can go into the history and the background and whatever, but that's what American military doctrine is. And you really see it when they get involved, like Somalia. And under those conditions, I don't think American troops ought to be allowed anywhere. Furthermore, the United States is, it's not a criticism of the soldiers, These are the military doctrines of the leadership, and the command. That's the way it works. And it's based on certain assumptions about what we're allowed to do in the world. And we kick other people in the face, The United States also doesn't get involved anywhere where somebody's going to shoot at it. So other countries can put their peacekeeping forces in Yugoslavia where somebody may shoot at them, but the United States won't. I will bomb, from 10,000 feet. Yeah, we're happy to do that. But nothing more than that. And that's not a contribution to anything. So when you ask for a constructive proposal from the American peace movement about what the United States ought to do in this particular circumstance, I just can't think of a lot to say. I wish I could, I've never heard a constructive proposal from anyone else either. It's a really unpleasant situation. It's not only Yugoslavia. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Yugoslavia. Things are worse in Angola, for example. Why isn't there any talk about Angola? Well, what happens in Yugoslavia might harm the interests of rich white people. It can spill over to Central Europe and, affect people of wealth and power. If blacks slaughter each other in Angola, what do we care? Furthermore, in Yugoslavia, you can blame Serbian peasants. Crazed Serbian peasants are probably communists anyway, so it makes good propaganda. Who do you blame in Angola? Well, unfortunately, you have to blame the guy who we were praising as the world's leading freedom fighter and the greatest hero of the 20th century, Savimbi, our guy, who was being praised by Jeane Kirkpatrick and Ronald Reagan and the whole bunch, and who we were supporting while he was carrying out monstrous terrorist atrocities. And that's not a good story either. So nobody talks about Angola. But if you ask, should American forces move into Angola, I'd say no for the same reason. Somebody's forces maybe, but not ours, not as long as we're this country. If we could change, well, okay, but that requires changes. So on those questions,
The top dog in the world?
Yeah.
It just seems like I don't understand how we can write off China and Russia as being that they're not. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I just want to hear you explain, and then I just had another question too. I'll ask you both at the same time about the fabric of the world today. I mean, we obviously know more than we do. You've watched it for about who knows how many years.
Too many. That's a secret.
What I'd like to ask you is what you see extrapolated in the future. because it looks to us, or to me anyways, that the fabric of everything is just coming unraveled. And I was just wondering what you had to say about that. It looks like we're headed for some type of destructive end. It doesn't look that good. I mean, I just wanted to hear what you had to say about that, and the other thing too.
Well, about, you pointed out that, I mean, I had said that the United States is top dog, and you said, you know, what about Russia and China? Well, top dog doesn't mean only dog, it just means top dog. There are other powers in the world. I wouldn't have listed Russia and China, but German-based Europe and Japan and its region are powers. In fact, economically speaking, the world is kind of tripolar, you know, with three major economic regions. Russia and China are very, you know, whatever they, I mean, Russia had been a third world power. It was beginning to develop independently, and even as a third world power, it was a big military force. You know, back in the 19th century, when Russia was a deeply impoverished third world dependency of the West, you know, all the investment was French and so on, it still had a very frightening military force. You know, it's an unusual third world power. Now Russia is devastated. I mean, it's doing a lot of ugly things. Like our man, Yeltsin, is reconstructing Russian imperialism all over the, you know, the former Soviet region. He's, you know, acting in various ways to extend and rebuild Russian power, and we're kind of backing him in that. And that's, you know, unpleasant, but it doesn't put them into the front rank. As far as China is concerned, I mean, it's a developing country, and it's got, you know, it's a complicated story. I mean, I don't think that China's development looks from the Chinese point of view as exciting as it does from the standpoint of Western investors. Hundreds of millions of Chinese are left out of that system, and there are quite a few China experts who wouldn't be surprised to find peasant revolutions breaking out again as the system collapses. You know, the environment collapses and the support system collapses and so on.
You believe that China's headed the same direction as the Soviet Union then?
No. China's following a different course. China didn't follow Western advice, and as a result, it's doing a lot better. That's not a joke, you know. The Soviet Union followed Western prescriptions. You know, they listened to the guys from Harvard and so on. And that meant dismantle the system and turn it over to private power, which is a total disaster. No country's ever developed that way. It's always a disaster. China played it differently. They did it their own way. They are building up some kind of private market economy, but they are not dismantling the old state-run economy. They're keeping it. And what they're doing is building something up around it. Well, you know, I mean, it's having mixed effects. But one effect is that they have not suffered the disaster of Eastern Europe yet. They may, but they haven't yet.
Well, what about the Zhirinovsky and the Lipton he's talking about, and the nuclear weapons? Yeah. They all have the nuclear weapons
they got
still.
Nuclear weapons, yeah, and that's potentially dangerous. And if we really drive Russia back to a third world power, you'll get chauvinist elements who can be pretty violent and destructive. And that's a problem, I agree. It's not that, you know, the world, when I say that the U.S. isn't a dominant position, the country that's in the dominant position doesn't pull all the strings. It just has the dominant influence. And in fact, the U.S. has a remarkably dominant influence in the world now, maybe more than in the past. Also, despite everything else, we're still by far the biggest economy. And we have unusual advantages. I mean, there's no other industrial country that has anything like the internal resources we have, or the scale, or anything else. I mean, we ought to be the best off people in the world by a long shot, and we're not. You know, in fact, by most measures, we're well down the list, which is just a scandal. You know, it shows how badly run the economy is. It's a real scandal. What's going to happen in the future? Well, you know, I hope things will change, but assuming present tendencies, I think it's fairly clear what is happening. Over the past 20 years in particular, there has been a considerable expansion in the power of absolutist, private, unaccountable power in the world, meaning transnational corporations and financial institutions. They are totalitarian institutions. They do what they feel like internally. Nobody has a say about it. I mean, if Thomas Jefferson were to wake up today, he'd be appalled. That's exactly the kind of thing he thought the American Revolution was fighting to destroy. Unaccountable private power, which is now transnational in scale and enormous. I mean, the scale should really be kept in mind as it's grown in the last years. I mean, by now, about 40% of what's called world trade is really not trade at all. It's just internal transactions within big firms. So moving something from one branch of a firm to another branch of the same firm, which happens across a border because, you get some tax privilege or cheaper labor or something like that. Over half of what are called our exports to Mexico, over half don't even enter the Mexican market. They're just transferred by some American corporation to assembly plants, which happen to be on the other side of the border, and then shipped right back. That's not exports, and it's not trade. And those numbers are big, and growing. Well, all of that is centrally managed transactions in radical violation of market principles, all centrally managed in a kind of totalitarian fashion, and it's increasing. And the same is true of finance capital, which is increasing even faster. So there's been a huge explosion in the amount of unregulated financial capital in the world. The latest World Bank estimate was $14 trillion. That is a big effect on policies. It means that no government can carry out national economic planning of a kind which would stimulate the economies, because that money is looking for what they call stable currencies, meaning deflationary policies, not growth. And if somebody's trying to move towards stimulative policies which will yield growth, that money's just going to move. And $14 trillion, of which about $1 trillion can be transferred every day, that just overwhelms governments. As a lot of economists have noted, these factors are leading the world towards a low-growth, low-wage, high-profit economy. Meanwhile, every major society just about is polarizing at different rates. It's a worldwide phenomenon. The gap between the poor and the rich countries is growing very fast. But the gap between poor and rich people across countries is growing even faster. And it's happening in just about every country. We see it very clearly here. Inequality in the United States, which was declining up until the 60s, has been increasing. It's now back to, I think, about the 20s. Real wages have been declining. Things like the 40-hour week are a dream. American workers fought for it for 80 years. They finally got it. They lost it totally. Nobody even thinks about it anymore. In fact, even having a job is something of a dream. This recovery, so-called, I mentioned the fact that it's unusual because it's been associated with decline in wages, which is unheard of, but it's also been associated with a remarkable increase in temporary workers. I think about 27% of the new jobs that have been created during the so-called recovery are temps. That's people who would like to have a job but can't. They work for the biggest private employer in the United States now is, according to Fortune magazine, is Manpower Incorporated, temporary workers. Now for business, that's great. I mean, these workers you don't have to pay any benefits to, you don't care about, you don't like them, you kick them in the face, you get somebody else. It's kind of like slavery. It's worse than slavery. I mean, in the case of slavery, the slave owner at least had a capital investment in the slave. You wanted to keep him alive, like, you want to keep your car functioning. This is worse than slavery.
You think that this is
and that's increasing. Furthermore, it's increasing worldwide. And furthermore, the elite groups are very happy about it. That's the reason for all this triumphalism you read about how great we are. The Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago had an article on what they called a welcome development of transcendent importance. They don't usually have rhetoric like that. What was it? Wages of American workers were now lower than any industrial country outside of Britain, where Thatcher had done even better in beating people down. So they're like 20% lower than Italy. Now, in 1985, the United States had the highest wage level in the world, which is what you'd expect in the richest country in the world. Now we got the lowest. Not the lowest in the world, so we're not like Papua New Guinea, but the lowest of any industrial country, and that's going to go down. Furthermore, there's a whipsaw effect. You drive down wages of American workers, that pulls down wages of other industrial countries. Just as American corporations can shift operations from Buffalo to northern Mexico to Poland, German corporations can shift operations to Alabama, as they in fact are now doing, where they can get workers for much, like I think 60% or so of the wages of German workers. Okay, that's a weapon for German manufacturers to increase polarization in Germany, to beat down the German workforce and the German poor. And this goes, it's whipsaw, it goes internationally. When a company like, say, General Motors moves to Poland, it's not because they believe in the free market. They hate the free market. So they move to Poland, they get 30% tariff protection. What they believe in is free markets for the poor and government protection for the rich. That's the doctrinal line. And the effect of all of this, of which the so-called trade agreements, which aren't really trade agreements, is a part, is to increase polarization and also to decrease democracy. Because as power gets shifted more and more into the hands of unaccountable private power, that means that the role of parliamentary institutions naturally declines. And the trade agreements accelerate that.
Do you think they planned this? It's a whole big calculating thing?
You don't have to be a genius to support it. I mean, you don't even have to plan it. I mean, if say, a corporate executive or a government planner thinks about their immediate short-term gain, yeah, that's what it is. I mean, after all, your business, after all, in an economy, I mean, take your favorite Chicago school economist. What you're supposed to do is increase profit and market share. I mean, you're supposed to do just what Adam Smith said. Adam Smith despised capitalism. And if you look back at what he actually said, not what is attributed to him, what he said is that well, he didn't use the term, but what we call a capitalist society, he said that the masters will follow what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, namely, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. Yeah, that's the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. And if that's unconstrained by democratic practices, that's just what will happen. So you don't have to plan long-term things. I mean, as you follow the vile maxim, and that's the values that we profess, you're supposed to try to do that. You'll get things like this, just as a kind of like a consequence of the socioeconomic institutions and the ideological system. I mean, if there's no concern about, take things like, pick any part of it you like. Take, say, vouchers for schools. Where's the pressure for vouchers for schools coming from? Well, the idea that is behind it is, look, I want to get the best education for my kids, and I can get that with vouchers. Well, that's one value. There's another value which says I would like to live in a society where kids have good education, whether they're my kids or the kids down the street or the kids on the other side of town or whatever, because I feel that I'm part of a community and I would like this community to have certain qualities, like, for example, reasonable lives for children. Well, those are just different value systems. We are emphasizing the first, the vile maxim. And if we pursue that, and we forget about notions like solidarity and sympathy and care about what happens to others and so on, which are just as much part of human nature as, kicking everybody in the face, shows up in different circumstances, okay, we know where the tendencies will lead. I mean, it's kind of interesting to look at the conception of human nature that underlies these kind of prestige economists, the Chicago economists, guys who win the Nobel Prize. Take a look sometime at people like James Buchanan, won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. I mean, I wish I could quote it exactly, so I may be getting it slightly wrong, but he has, somewhere in one of his books, he says that he describes what he calls human nature, and he's sort of describing a market society. He says, look, what everybody would want, what every person in the world would want is for everybody else to be their slave and do their bidding. Well, we can't quite have that, so we therefore enter into market relations. I mean, a person who wants that, is pathological. I mean, a person who wants everyone else in the world to be their slave, it's the kind of guy you're sort of sorry for, or something like maybe, try to pat him on the head or something and make him not be so lunatic. But a person who feels that way is just pathological. Well, if, that kind of pathology is, in fact, what, is given a prestige role in the ideological system, and you can see why. Pursuing that ideology, in fact, supports the privileged and the powerful, and leads exactly to the kind of polarization that's taking place. This is not even mentioning things like environmental concerns. which may do us all in before any of this stuff matters. And that's not a joke, I mean, nobody knows the details about, say, the greenhouse effect, but I don't think there's a serious scientist who doubts that it's a significant phenomenon. You can argue about timing, which nobody really understands, but there are very substantial dangers that big global changes will take place which simply make human life virtually impossible. Well, those are not going to be dealt with by the vile maxim, you can be sure of that. Those are going to take democratic societies which have concern for others and for future generations and so on. Totally different value system. So I think you can see where the tendencies are going. And the question is, do we stand by and let them go that way? You don't have to. Why don't we finish just the people who are standing here and then we'll go on. Yeah.
Political power is quite disturbing, to say the least. And wouldn't consider myself a wild-eyed revolutionary, but I think it's really clear to see that any change would involve removing people that are very firmly entrenched in power, including the media and some of these transnational corporations, and people that are very deeply entrenched in our governmental institutions. You tend to demur on this question of what we should do a lot when I hear you speak. I'd really like you to propose some ideas of how this could be changed and what individuals can do, what institutions can do, what higher education can do, like the last earlier.
There are a lot of different things to do on different issues. So if you mention specific issues like, healthcare, I have my own views as to what I think ought to be done. And my views happen to be in line with about 70% of the population, so it's not particularly outlandish. Namely, we should move to some kind of a tax-based national health care system and cut down the huge bureaucracy and everything else. Well, that's not on the agenda because it misses two properties. There are two respects in which it's intolerable to the elite. One, it's fair, meaning it's not regressive. If it's a tax-based system, it means you pay, what you pay is kind of proportional to, it's progressive as the tax system is. The U.S. system has to be regressive. So the Clinton system and the Cooper system, they're flat rate, essentially. Like you're poor, you pay the same amount as if you're rich. Lee Iacocca and his, secretary pay the same amount. That's radically regressive. So that's one thing. Soak the poor is one thing it has to have. The other thing it has to have is put power in the hands of the big insurance companies, meaning that the public has to pay their huge executive salaries and their enormous profits and their advertising costs and their fantastic bureaucracies as they kind of micromanage doctors to ensure that everybody gets the worst possible care and so on and so forth. Those are the two conditions that the American system has to meet, and I don't think it should. I think we should move to a tax-based national health care system, something kind of on the Canadian model, which is not really national health care, it's national insurance. So that's one thing I think we can do. If you talk about deeper problems, like what about the power of private institutions like transnationals, deeper problem, I think they should be dismantled. They're like the kind of thing that the American Revolution was fought for, to dismantle absolute power. You go back to the ideology of, famous founding fathers. What they were talking about is that there should not be unaccountable private power. Now, in those days, unaccountable power meant the King of England, the feudal system, the church, slavery. Oh, well, I'm sorry that they waffled on that one. But it's clear what they were talking about. There were no corporations in those days. In fact, there were corporations, but they were public trusts. So a corporation in those days meant a publicly run operation for some public need, like building a bridge. The rise of corporate capitalism was well in the future. And the idea of transnational corporations, nobody dreamed of. Well, okay, we have new systems of power, absolutist private power, unaccountable, which go way beyond anything that was dreamed of, and they should be dismantled just as the feudal system was. Now, that you don't do with a flick of the wrist. That's a matter of substantial changes, substantial social changes, which should ultimately put, in my view, decision-making over the economy and social life in public hands. That means in the hands of the workforce, of the communities, and the general public. I don't think there should be any rights to investors. They have no rights, in my opinion. And it's not a matter of kicking particular people out. It doesn't matter who is in charge. You change one CEO for another, they have to act the same way, because that's the nature of the institution. The question is, do we want institutions of domination and authority? And I think the same questions arise no matter what you're looking at. Take, say, look at family structures. I mean, family structures have relations of authority and domination inside them. And we all know that. Are they legitimate? I mean, they involve men and women and parents and children and all sorts of things. Are they legitimate? Well, any relation of authority, I think, ought to be challenged. Any relation of authority. And it ought to be made to justify itself. It should be forced to justify itself. Now, sometimes I think that can be done. Like, if I'm taking a walk with my 3-year-old grandchild, and she runs across the street and I grab her and pull her back, that's an authoritarian relationship. I think it should be challenged, but I think it's justified. I think I can give a justification for it. Okay? But, most of these things you really can't justify. And if they can't be justified, well, they should be changed. And that's true wherever you look in society, Pardon? How do you change it? Well, there are the way that other systems of authority. I mean, a lot of these things have been challenged and changed just in our own lifetimes. Like these. A lot of changes have taken place. You change them through education and organization and pressure and struggle and so on. There's no big secrets about this. One of the reasons I don't talk about it is it's obvious. There's no secrets. It's always been done the same way all through history. I mean, it just takes dedication and commitment, and, you try to understand, and you help other people understand, and you let them try to help you to understand, and you form organizations, and you put pressures, and you take over power systems, and so on. It's the way slavery was ended. It's the way civil rights were achieved. That's the way the changes that were introduced through the feminist movement happened. That's the way, the feudal system was dissolved. There just aren't any other ways. And we all know them, The question is to do something about them. Some of them are going to be a lot harder than others, like attacking transnational corporations and investment firms. That's a big task. I mean, that's not going to happen until a large part of the population is deeply committed to it and understands what they're up to. Then it can happen. But it's not going to happen because, we have conversations about it. So depending on the issue, there's different things to be suggested. I don't know of any general tactics. There are specific goals on specific things you try to change. I mean, I think it would make sense to try to, one respect in which the United States is, there's some, there are a lot of very good things about the country, like it's very free and people are very independent and they don't get kicked around and stuff. But there's some bad things too. It's a very atomized society. People are very much alone. They don't talk to each other, they don't have associations, there's no political parties, there's virtually no unions. I mean, to an extraordinary extent, people, and particularly this is true, I think, more of children by now, are just sitting alone, glued to the television set or something. They're not interacting with one another. Actually, I'm very concerned about the new technology in that respect. There's a sense in which all this new technology, connects people, but in a very impersonal way. I mean, like, we're human beings, we're not Martians, And there's a big, I may be wrong about this, but I think there's a big difference in face-to-face human contacts and sitting at a keyboard, and punching, and some guy over somewhere else sits at that keyboard and punches something back. I think there's something very alienating about those kinds of connections. And also isolating. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think there's a lot of these tendencies going on, and I think we ought to think about them at least, maybe counter them. I mean, I wish I don't know general formulas. All I know is truisms, really, applied to particular situations.
Yeah, I have a question that I'll give you a chance to comment on some of the solutions that the state is already implementing and your feelings about their potential in the future. In a few academic circles, discussions about third world social movements now without the minimal support from the Soviet Union and its slight restraint of U.S. aggression centers around those movements forced subservient to Western-style democracy and its consequent exploitation. With that, some feel that violence in those countries will generally decrease since the leadership for those movements must accept the harsh reality. but there is now a feeling that with the exploitive capitalist system expanding its influence through NAFTA and GATT, it will eventually disenfranchise so many people, to include a larger segment of the U.S. population, that there will be a veritable calm before the storm. Personally, I wonder how long it will take that disenfranchise to start the storm, because the factors to create those globally devastating conditions which will lead to mass uprisal seem to be starting now. In the meantime, do you feel that since this country, with its potential for freedom, will install a stronger domestic police state to quell these subsequent popular movements that seem to be the only hope for salvation, not only in this country, but in the whole world in general?
Yeah, I mean, that's asking for predictions in places we don't know how to, nobody, certainly me, but I don't think anybody knows enough about society and social forces to make any predictions about that. I mean, I think all the things you're pointing to are very realistic possibilities. How they'll play themselves out, I have no idea. I think there's there's a serious likelihood of increased violent uprisings, and they may take various forms. I mean, Chiapas in Mexico is one form. South Central Los Angeles is another form. I mean, South Central Los Angeles was also an uprising. It happened to be a very unconstructive one. Like it wasn't like Chiapas. However, I think what it was about was quite similar. In South Central Los Angeles, this is a community where people used to have jobs, where there used to be industry, where they're now driven into despair, partly because the industries have been shifted away for profit-making reasons. And the way they reacted was just, looting and destruction and burning. Well, that's the difference between a society that's demoralized and a society that has some social structure and organization. Now, the peasants in the Mayan areas of Mexico are much poorer than people in South Central Los Angeles, like they got fewer television sets and that sort of thing. But it's a viable society. And we've succeeded in creating unviable societies with complete demoralization and disintegration, so that the only way they react is by extreme violence. That's why we have so many killings and guys running around with assault rifles and stuff. However, apart from that difference, I think the two things are quite similar, and I'd expect a lot more of it. As to the matter of being repressive, that's just what that crime bill's about. That crime bill is an extremely repressive legislation. And nobody thinks it's going to affect crime. In fact, all the experts who are quoted say right off, yeah, it's not going to have any effect on crime. But it is highly punitive. Some of its measures, I mean, I don't know if it'll go through. It's only passed the Senate, but some of the measures are pretty extreme. For example, membership in a gang is a crime under that. That's pretty extreme. You're a kid growing up in a ghetto, what are your options? I mean, you shouldn't be a member of a gang. You can't, there's nothing for you to do. You can't survive. To make that a crime is really to criminalize life, under the conditions that exist. And, they had dozens of new death sentences. I mean, the whole idea of a death sentence is, it's just barbaric. Most countries don't have it. But to extend it, that's unbelievable. That's a very punitive measure.
Well, what I see is unless there's more involvement by the mass population, what's going to be seen is more sporadic violent uprisals that will be
meant by more repression.
Much more repression that we're going to have to not only be a witness to, but probably be a victim of.
Yeah, that's very likely. I mean, it is a very demoralized society. People are scared of violence, and they have a right to be. I mean, I'm scared of violence too. I don't like it. I don't like the fact that I can't walk in the streets without being worried that somebody's going to come out with an assault rifle and blow me away or something. And the question is, how do you respond to that? Well, one way to respond to it, and the way in which people do respond in demoralized societies, they say, okay, let's have a powerful state that just kicks everybody in the face. Nazi state. You can get support for that. Another way is to say, look, there's a reason why you have violence in South Central Los Angeles and on the rich suburbs. Straightforward reason. Everybody knows the answer. Okay, let's deal with the reasons. That's a different approach. If we take the second approach, then it won't happen. Of course, Clinton and everybody else in power is appealing to the worst instincts. They want people to be frightened and support authority and not to raise questions about the long-term tendencies that are leading to these things. Well, it's understandable from their point of view. They're big business representatives, but we don't have to accept that.
Yeah, again, I see it, the only solution is for individuals like us here to get involved in some sort of capacity. Otherwise, things are only going to get worse.
That's right. And get involved means really get involved in an organized fashion. There isn't very much that individuals can do. I think you're absolutely right on that. Yeah, last point.
Considering democracy on drugs and stuff, and I was wondering if you thought drugs should be legalized, like marijuana or all drugs, specifically marijuana or all drugs. And I read Albert Einstein recently quite a bit on him, and he was against prohibition and a lot of things like that. And I was wondering what your opinion was on like Albert Einstein's economic views and his political views, using socialism with capitalism, what you thought about him and legalizing marijuana.
Well, Einstein was kind of like an old-fashioned socialist in the sense in which just about, most educated people were in his generation. He didn't really have a lot of detailed thinking about it. He just accepted the general values of socialism.
He seemed to be pretty prophetic, though, in like the destruction that would come to capitalism.
Yeah, but those were, I think what he said was, reasonable and intelligent, but we should also remember that those were basically the perspectives of kind of more or less sane people. Working class people and, intellectuals and so on. It's taken a lot of effort to beat those ideas out of people's heads. Basically they were right, but he didn't, it wasn't his interest really. He didn't spell it out much. The drug question, I don't think is one that one can take a, you can't take a casual attitude towards it. It's a serious question. And my feeling is a fair amount of experimentation is required. Like I wouldn't myself advocate any wide-ranging moves, but I think that there are some natural ways of experimenting. One of them has to do with just what you mentioned. Take, say, marijuana. Marijuana is not good for you. There's no doubt about that. But it's basically not, it's not harmful. It's probably not as bad as coffee, let's say. Coffee is also not good for you, but I'm not in favor of making coffee criminal.
But locking up thousands of people for marijuana is, you would say, is dead wrong.
Well, but that's because it's, there's reasons for that. They didn't want young people to be more free, and they didn't want them to be more independent. They're afraid of all kind of things and so on. But as far as we know, I've looked into this a bit. Again, I don't want to seem to be, these are important issues. You should really understand them. And I have my own views. We should look further. My own views, adding all the qualifications and so on, is that legalization of marijuana is probably a good idea. As far as I know, there's, last time I looked at the scientific details, which was a couple of years ago, about when I wrote that book, in fact, there were about 60 million cases on record of marijuana use and not a single OD. That's
so you
pretty
would support
substantial.
the legalization of it?
Well, I think it's probably, there are a lot, it's a complicated issue, but my guess is probably yes, and at least experimentation with it. Now, the effect of making marijuana illegal has been to bring in much more lethal drugs. Marijuana is big and bulky. It's easy to stop. And in fact, cutting back marijuana is pretty simple. It hasn't terminated, but it's easy to stop at the border and so on. So naturally, under a system of criminalization, it just drives people to high-tech drugs, which are hard to stop, like cocaine, which are much more harmful. So the effect of the illegalization of marijuana, as far as I can make out, has been to drive lots of people. They're taking drugs for some reason. Maybe it's a bad reason, and you should deal with the reasons, but they're doing it for some reason. And those reasons are just going to drive them to much more dangerous drugs, high-tech drugs, basically, and that's just what's happened. I am very suspicious about the illegalization of marijuana, frankly, and I think somebody ought to look into this, but here's a suspicion that somebody might explore. Why is marijuana illegal and tobacco legal? It's a good question. Tobacco is a lot more harmful.
How can they push alcohol on a TV commercial?
Yeah.
Then
Well, let's take two things that are very similar. Tobacco and marijuana, both crops. Why is it that marijuana is illegal and tobacco is legal? I have a suspicion about that. My suspicion is that marijuana is just too easy to grow. You can't monopolize it. You can't make any profit on it. I mean, everybody can grow marijuana in their backyard. It's a weed. Tobacco is an industrial product. It takes a lot of technology and a lot of capital investment and so on and so forth, and you can make a lot of money on it. So tobacco is legal and marijuana is illegal, because it's like solar energy. If it worked, everybody would have it. Nobody would make any money. That's a guess, and I think it'd be worth researching. Anyhow, on the marijuana issue, I think there's plausible arguments which should certainly be explored and maybe followed through on just to legalize it. What about other drugs? Well, criminalization of drugs is in general a rather dubious idea. And there are other ways that can be used. Like, say, in England in the early 19th century, the question of alcohol was becoming very serious. It's kind of like drugs today, and it's harmful. Alcohol kills a lot more people than all drugs put together, tobacco even more. The way it was dealt with in England turned out in retrospect to be kind of reasonable. It was not illegal, but the taxation system was designed so as to kind of induce people to use less harmful types of alcohol. So it was designed to push people towards the pub, where you get a pint of beer, and not towards hard liquor. Well, that turned out to be fairly successful. I think that a similar logic makes sense in the case of hard drugs today. The serious hard drugs like cocaine and so on, they are very harmful.
Well, a lot of people are saying that, a lot of these lyrics and music anyways, are saying that if they legalized pot, then maybe they would use that more than
I would think that's true. Just as making pot illegal has driven people to harder and more destructive drugs, it's very likely that the reverse effect would take place too.
And I know this is off the subject quick, but after a few years of thinking about it, the only solution I could possibly see to ending the crime problem in the ghetto and that is to tear them down, is to physically destroy large portions of them and dislocate people. That appears to be the only solution. Do you think that?
No, I don't agree with that.
You don't think that?
First of all, these are communities and people want to live with one another and they have, commitments.
Yeah,
there are plenty of people who live in the ghettos who have roots in the community. They're not just jungles. It seems to me that we should pay attention to what is, after all, an obvious fact. Like, I live in a middle-class suburb. Okay, and downtown Boston, is monstrous. Kids are going to school with guns. There's a reason for that. Where I live, people are pretty well off, and they have pretty good jobs and that sort of thing. And they rip off the city, like it's not everybody else, I rip off the city, the poor people in Boston. Like, I don't pay the taxes for downtown Boston, but I use its services, right? To fix the streets where I live costs virtually nothing, because only a couple of wealthy people drive around there. But I don't just drive on my streets, I also drive on the streets in downtown Boston, where it costs a hell of a lot to fix them, because everybody's driving there, and the poor people down there pay it. And in that and 1,000 other ways, there's a whole system in the country which is in fact a huge welfare state for the rich. Enormous welfare. I have people in my neighborhood have houses, meaning mortgages, meaning tax reductions for mortgage payments. A tax reduction for a mortgage payment is exactly equivalent to a welfare payment from the government. It's the same thing. About 80% of those tax reductions go to people with incomes over $80,000. So that's just, and there's a million other things like that. There's a whole complex system.
Well, you were saying that like you noticed that it was obvious that it's the neighborhood that they grow up in.
Yeah, it's the neighborhood. It's not just the neighborhood. Yeah, but look, tearing down the neighborhood doesn't change anything. The people are still going to be facing the same.
Those 10,000 kids that you move are going to grow up better.
No, they're not. They're just going to grow up in another slum, because the parents are still not going to have jobs.